Welcome back to Today with Dr. Kaye. I'm Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead, here again to have an in-depth conversation with you about the stories that matter. If they are important, if they are interesting, if it has your ear, then it has our attention. We now open up a conversation about the N-word. The use of the word, the nature of the word, why it's so controversial, who can say it and who can't, and what does it mean to have a word that's been shortened from its original word to just an initial, the N-word. I'm joined by phone by Dr. Neil Lester. He's a professor of English at Arizona State University and the founding director of Project Humanities. Dr. Lester, welcome to Today with Dr. Kaye.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's just get right into it, because the N-word has been the center of debate for years. Why is this word, which rhymes with the word trigger, because that's what actually seems to happen to people when they hear it, why is it so controversial?
Oh, my God. I think it's so controversial because race relations in this country are still pretty contentious. And I don't think until we can resolve the issue of racism, American racism, in its various manifestations, that I think we're going to forever have a word that seems to embody all that disparages and all that is part of our violent American history.
Now, Farash Adeyi once called the N-word kind of the nuclear bomb of racial epithets. Like, that is the word that you use when you want to stop a conversation. Why is it that, given the amount of time that's passed between now and, of course, the ending of American enslavement, why is this word still used in the same sense that it's always been used?
Well, because nothing about race relations have particularly changed. I mean, however illusory we seem to be about this post-racial, and I think maybe some people have revisited that since November 2016, the same sentiments used back in the 1500s, the 1600s are being used today. And, you know, this whole kind of illusory belief that we have somehow taken something back overlooks the reality of the history that you can't take anything back that you never owned. So the history of the presence of those of African descent in this country continues to be disparaged, and if there's a way to disparage someone, it has to be in the labeling of them and the naming of them in a way that's intended to disparage, intimidate, and even violate. So that hasn't changed, and that's the sad part, is that, you know, when this word was a word that was identified with a group of people, not as an individual identity, but as a collective identity, that particular identity hasn't stopped. Just Google or do a Google alert on the N-word, and you'll see that it's still being used. And every time it shows up in headlines, we see that we have not moved from that moment where a group is still disparaged by another group in the most repulsive, sometimes violent ways.
Now, I kind of see the N-word, or being called the N-word, almost as a rite of passage. I'm from the South.
Mm-hmm.
And when I asked people in preparation for our conversation, do they remember the first time that they were called the N-word? People have very vivid memories of the first time that word was used to them. What about you? When's the first time you were called the N-word? Did it ever happen to you?
It's interesting because my research and teaching and public lectures on this did not come out of some personal space or some trauma that I had as a kid growing up. In fact, that word was not used on me or toward me until quite recently, in the last year, when I and my initiative here at Arizona State were doing our outreach to homeless individuals in downtown Phoenix. These are adults, and a young man, probably a young adult in his 20s, was upset because I asked him to follow the rules rather than jumping in line and grabbing a pair of shoes. And that's what he pulled out of his weaponry, was to baptize me with the N-word. Now, my spouse, who is Argentine and Italian, when we were in graduate school, was called the N-word lover. So that's the closest that I came to being called that word. So this doesn't come out of some kind of personal right for me necessarily. In fact, it's just the opposite, because I was curious about why in 2008 the word was still being used for then Senator Barack Obama, when I thought that we had actually had that conversation and had moved forward. because it's not part of my social circle.
And what's interesting when we talk about the N-word and we talk about the ways in which we're trying to process it, because for some people, and we know this is not all, but for some people, there is a lot of pain associated with being in that space when that word is directed to you. When you do the type of work that you do, where you go around the country and you speak about this, how do you help people just to process the pain around the word?
Well, that's interesting because pain can be manifested in different ways. And so one of the ways that I've been able to do this is to look at children's texts, to look at pop culture, to look at advertisements, to look at minstrel songs in ways in which this was so everyday. The ways in which cleaning products or hair products or any number of products it was very common to see these words there. But I also look at this relative to not just the word, but what the word signifies. So there are ways in which this word is inherently connected to these gross images that we associate with American minstrelsy. So there's a pain of a different type. And then I sort of pair that with the ways in which we talk about, say, the Birmingham bombing or the dogs being sicked on people during the civil rights movement. And we show some of those picket signs where the N-word is being used. So I throw all of that into the mix so that this is not just one type of pain, but this is about trauma more broadly and the ways in which that trauma was so normalized through language, and a word that was beyond the 6 letters that compose the word or that comprise the word, but rather this is what the word represents. And there's for me, a very effective piece by Common in an ESPN special where he talks about the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham. And he says that when the KKK decided to bomb that, they didn't individualize the names. They said there's a church full of N-words. And the ways in which those 4 girls were decapitated and killed is all about the N-word. That's our American history. So when you talk a little bit about what preceded, NWA, right, then this becomes a very different conversation for those who are conscious and open to the possibility that you can't take anything back that you didn't own.
Now, it's a word that continues to be debated. It continues to be discussed. Very recently, author Ta-Nehisi Coates actually kind of jumped into the fray when he was asked this question. Why don't we take a listen to the clip, and then we can talk about it more on the other side.
Sure.
Last week, Northwestern had this concert with Lil Uzi Vert. He uses the N-word profusely, like a ton, and there was an email sent out to students who went to this concert saying, you don't have a right to use this word, which I 100% agree with. Like, as a white person, I don't have any right. I haven't, until reparations are paid, until there's some sort of giving back, there's no right. But what do you say to, I don't know what to do when I hear my friends using this word in a song. I don't know what to do when it's all the time.
Words don't have meaning without context, okay? My wife refers to me as honey. That's accepted and okay between us. If we were walking down the street together and a strange woman referred to me as honey, that wouldn't be acceptable. The understanding is I have some sort of relationship with my wife. Hopefully I have no relationship with this strange woman. When I was young and I used to go see my family in Philadelphia where my dad was from, they will all call him Billy. His name is William Paul Coates. No one in Baltimore called him Billy. And had I referred to my father as Billy, that probably would have been a problem. That's because the relationship between myself and my dad is not the same as the relationship between my dad and his mother and his sisters who he grew up with, right? We understand that. It's the same thing with words within the African American community or within any community.
So this idea that words have meanings and beginning to understand the history of words and trying to connect that together. Well, what I think is most interesting in that clip, Dr. Lester, is not Ta-Nehisi Coates' answer. What's interesting to me is the actual question where the student, and I'm just going to assume she's a student, where the student says, at this moment, I don't have a right until like some sort of reparations are paid or things are done. And then once that's taken care of, the assumption is then you can use the word. Can you kind of unpack that part of it for us?
Yes. In fact, that has circulated, and everybody and their sister and brother have asked for a response. And I first start with I'm sort of stunned by the question, because I'm so tired of non-people of color asking, what do I do? People, I have in the work that I've been doing over the past several years relative to this word, there is not one person who doesn't know that there's a problem with that word. Now, they may disagree with this notion, as Tim Weiss puts it, American history is a double standard. So in this case, there may be a double standard. But it's not really a question. And this sort of qualification, like all of a sudden something's going to happen, so then I'll be able to say it, is problematic also. But I also find his response not without some problems there, because I certainly wouldn't equate that word to honey, where there is a relationship. We have lawsuits now. We have the NAACP that have shown that black people don't necessarily agree on the use of this word. So to make this assumption that you can walk up to me and call me that or use that in my presence is a faulty assumption. That is different than my being in a relationship with somebody with whom I am, intimately connected, and we call each other that.
Right. That
we agree on. So that, to me, is faulty. And then, I have problems with the fact that in the response, he goes on, and not only does he say it, and that's his prerogative, I personally don't say it. You don't have to say it in order to acknowledge, but he also says these other things that are equally problematic when you start talking about words that disparage. So when you talk about the F word or the C word, and you're talking about identity,
right?
I had somebody else in my family say, well, the F word could have been the other word. I was like, no, that particular word is not about an identity. Okay, that is an action. We're talking about an identity here. So I guess the question didn't seem to be a question to me, and this whole thing of what should I do is something that I have yet to have a person of color come up to me after a conversation about the N-word, a public lecture, and say, what should I do? Just gave you tools. Tell me what you're already doing. If you hear that and it bothers you, you should say something about it. You don't need me to tell you that. So that to me is an interesting conversation that's so nuanced, but I didn't find that it was a real question or a question that seemed to present anything than further complications about what her perspective is of the white person, that all of a sudden one day they're going to be reparations paid, and then you'll be able to say it.
Which I think is very, very interesting.
I have been called by, certain universities whenever there's and not universities, high schools here, when there's an N-word episode, I get called in like Ghostbusters to kind of fix things, and then you go out until there's, the next thing. And it's interesting because it seems like we're not dealing with what is at the root of this. And at the root of this is the fact that we're still a very racist American society. And that of all the things, and it doesn't even matter if your skin is brown, anybody can wear that particular label. As I said, my spouse was called an N-word lover. And there are ways in which this is not just relegated to a sexual identity, to a gender, to a class, in ways that some of those other epithets are. This is an equal opportunity word. So I don't know why that person felt like it was an interesting performance in question asking.
Well, I thought so as well. I think what was most disturbing to me, and I think this is where I enter into the space at all times, is that it gets tiring sometimes as an African American when your white colleagues want you to do the heavy lifting. Tell me what, to me it's more of a parent-child relationship.
Right.
If my 2-year-old doesn't know how to do something, then at 2 years old, I'm going to teach him. Well, my son is now almost 17. I shouldn't have to teach you the same lesson that I taught you at 2. At some point, you got to build up that muscle know and figure out what to do. So here we are, where we still have white colleagues saying, well, what do I do? I'm well-intentioned. What do I do? Like, there's another aspect of that gets into this need for black people to be in the position of teaching white people how to deal with us.
Well, and I said there is not one white person I've encountered who's confused about that. They may disagree about the use of the word, and I say, okay, well, here's what the issue is. This is not criminal to say this word. You're not going to be, rushed in handcuffs unless it's associated with some kind of violent act or vandalism.
Right.
But you can say it until the cows come home. The issue is that there may be social consequences to it, and that you will have to deal with. But this notion of not knowing what to do, I think, is naive. And I said this after Charlottesville when I went into this funk, and I said, I just can't. These are white people against white people. White people need to talk to each other about these ways in which they are or are not being complicit in perpetuating racism. Will stand here, and rather than coming to me, asking me what to do, show me what you're already doing and tell me what we can do together. And that is the position that I take, and I'm pleased to say that there are people around me who are doing that. I've written a piece in Teaching Tolerance that spells that out. For people of color who are tired, we need the allies to step up.
Step up and
pull those
to help
and
us.
show me what you're doing.
Right.
She could have very easily said, this is what I do when I'm in a situation like that. You don't need somebody to tell you if this is a moral issue and it is somehow guiding your moral compass. You don't need somebody else to tell you that. And if I were to tell you what to do, what if it doesn't work? I don't have an answer to racism.
Right.
And every time there's a race moment, some of us get called in and we're supposed to talk for, a 30-minute segment or a 2-minute segment if it's the television here, and we're supposed to solve racism. Well, we didn't create it, so we can't solve it.
And I'm not sure if it's not
so
so easily solved. Right? I'm not sure if it's so easily solved.
Same thing about the other isms, too. So, straight folks have to stop the homophobia, and, it has to be about allyship. It can't be about make me a teachable moment.
Now, I want to go back a little bit because in 2007, the NAACP buried the N-word. I remember this distinctly. The whole funeral service, they're talking about, putting it into Detroit Memorial Park Cemetery, which is a historically black cemetery, giving it a headstone. And then Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick went through this whole long diatribe saying that, we're going to gather and bury all the things that go with the N-word. We're going to bury, he said, the pimps and the hoes that go with it, and die N-word. We don't want to see you round here no more. So these type of gestures don't seem to get us far along the path. No, they don't. And but I think this has to be a whole consciousness about language. I'm writing a piece now in my head and drafted it on ableist language. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of conversation about mental illness now, but yet we throw ableist language around very casually when somebody is whose mental health is being talked about. Or so there are ways in which we're just sloppy with language, and if we're sloppy with language, we are also sloppy in our thinking. And in that particular word, a lot of that, with the N-word, the specificity comes in people not knowing the history. And no matter what Kendrick Lamar says about respelling it or spelling it differently, and no matter what Tupac has said by giving it an acronym, which only 2 people probably even know what it stands for, then we have not embraced that and talking about ourselves as African descendants of kings and queens. That is not how I see it when I saw 2 young black men fighting at our homeless outreach, fighting each other and kicking each other in the teeth and baptizing each other in that word. And I, frankly, when I told you earlier about the person that called me that, couldn't tell if it was the G-A or the E-R. All I know is not a term of endearment in that context. So I think, there's some naivete going on there. I think one thing we haven't looked at is the ways in which black folks have internalized racism in that kind of Du Boisian double consciousness kind of way. We certainly do it with colorism, so I don't know why we couldn't do it the other way. And I do know, for example, that I will not be sort of tricked into saying, which is what some reporters want me to say, is I will never use the word. I don't use it casually. And I think that if we're talking about this in a historical context, if we're talking about the Civil Rights Movement, if we're talking about American slavery or something that happened,
then I think it's appropriate for the word to be used. So I don't put this kind of moratorium that it can't ever or we shouldn't use it. I choose not to use it. And to me, that's the power that I have to choose what comes out of my mouth.
I really struggle with the word. I actually do. I'm someone who studied social linguistics, so I think about the fact that we're giving a word power by saying we can't use it. It's kind of like teaching your child you can never curse, and the first thing they do when they get out on their own is they curse. It's that because
I haven't heard anybody who said you can't use it. I never said people can't use it.
Now I have heard that in the teachings in the school.
I choose not to use it.
Right,
That's
which I think is different.
than being told I can't use it, and I haven't told white people that because I think white people have their own moral compass. They know that word. I have not found one from high school on up to lifelong learners who are retired and older who don't know something about that word and the fact that it is a word that is a very problematic word. So I don't know where the dilemma is for other people who are struggling with how you should use it. Because I know I'm not going to use the B word, I know I'm not going to use the F word. I just know that. That's not something that I personally have to struggle with.
Now, it's something that we do with our teaching because there are some schools here in Baltimore City where using that word you end up getting suspended for using that word because there is something around it. So when we talk about us choosing not to use it, yes, you do have that choice. I'm talking about the ways that there are also stipulations around you using it. I don't mean out in the street when people are using it all the time. I think it's interesting within the schools if you use that word. Now, I have not heard the same kind of stipulations around the B word or if you use derogatory terms towards women or people who are same-sex preference. I know there should be, but they're not. What the word right now that is a suspendable word is the N word, which is a lot of power on one word, but it also reduces the amount of power and anger and hurt and frustration that comes along with the other words, right?
Well, but I will say this, though, and I said this earlier, though, this word is an equal opportunity word. that B word is associated with gender more often than not.
Right.
The F word is associated with sexuality more often than not. The R word is with mental capacity or class. None of those words apply to babies, for example, or infants. Right. And we have a whole history of evidence out there that shows how there are children's books, there are images of little black kids and, the 10 little N-word boys and N-word girls.
Oh, I remember that book.
I don't quite put that word in the same category as these others because this is equal opportunity. And, again, you don't have to be, of brown hue in order to be called that word. Those other words don't apply quite as universally in my experience and research. So I see those as slightly different. But I also see that if we're going to talk about a safe space within work environments or class environments, we should pay attention to every word that we're using.
Yes.
You talked about this, and I've seen this in the research that I've done too. Media has kind of a gray space about this word. Sometimes it's beeped out, sometimes it's not. Sometimes, if the very first piece that I wrote on this, which was about airbrushing the N-word, actually came from a real event that happened in in New York, where a young siblings were walking home and they were beat up by a gang of whites and baptized in that word. And the media couldn't decide in reporting it whether they should actually use the word or euphemize the word. But what struck me is when Ntozake Shange wrote the picture book called Whitewash that was based on the incident, she uses, instead of the N-word, they called us mud people. And I thought, wait a minute, now you're airbrushing inexperience.
And
this is somebody that I have studied and who breathed, the breath of life into me when it came to kind of understanding black folks and women and language and all that stuff. Here she is euphemizing it. And I thought, okay, I understand now that we still haven't quite resolved the tensions around that word. That word is the most, it's the cruelest, it's the most toxic. And I think you cited this earlier. There are ways in which superlatives are used about that word that are not used with other words that are epithets and that do, in fact, hurt people.
Well, we're going to hold it there for just a moment and take a short break. When we return, Dr. Lester is going to talk to us about his class, the N-word and anatomy lesson, and give us tips on how do we teach our children, how do we teach our students, how do we teach ourselves how to deal with this word. This is Today with Dr. Kaye. I'm Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead. Stay with us. Welcome back to Today with Dr. Kaye. I'm Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead, and we are talking about the N-word, the curious history around this word, who can use it, who cannot, and what are the choices that we make about it. I'm joined by phone by Dr. Lester, a professor of English at Arizona State University and the founding director of Project Humanities. Dr. Lester, thank you for staying with us.
Thank you.
So, in 2008, you taught the first ever college-level class entitled The N-Word and Anatomy Lesson. Can you talk a little bit about this class and why you chose to design it?
Yes. Well, in 2008, that's when then Senator Obama was running for president, and I was stunned. Well, I was serving as an administrator at the time, and the idea is that we wanted to, keep everybody at Arizona State University in the classroom teaching, and so the idea was to find a sexy course that would introduce first-year students to your discipline. And this was at the time that, as I said, we were having this sort of political first with Barack Obama getting as close to the nomination as I can recall. And I was stunned that there were so many references out there in social media that used that word with him. And I thought, wait a minute, what is this? I mean, by, all accounts, he had done the right thing and gone to the right schools and married the right people and, had the right sexual identity. I mean, there were just all these things. He looked right. I mean, there are all these things, and you can't see this, but I've got right in air quotes. So he didn't have cornrows, didn't have dreadlocks. He didn't marry a white woman. He did all the things that he should do as a black man who's trying to go. He went to the right schools.
Right.
And I thought, okay, what is that? I thought we had resolved that. And so what I often do is when I don't understand something is I'll try to create a course around it, or so that I can study along with my students and discover along with the students. So that's what I did. I started putting things together and started looking around and saying, okay, so where is this? Where is the tension here? And is this bigger than the word? And the answer that I got is absolutely yes. This is bigger than the 6 words. And trust me, when I taught that course and it was announced, and Teaching Tolerance actually did an interview on it, I had all kinds of insults hurled at me for teaching the course. Oh, we have to teach kids how to say the N-word. No, it wasn't teaching anybody how to say the word. It was sort of pulling out the layers behind that word to show that word signifies so much about American culture. So that was the nature of the course. And it was a 15-week course. Students self-selected to take it. But I can tell you it's one of the most transformative, for me, courses that I've been able to teach in my 30 years of teaching. And part of that is because it was really about me, and I had to kind of, respond when, and it wasn't all students of color in the class, and people tend to forget that I'm at a PWI, so I rarely, if ever, get an all-black class. So there were ways in which I had to kind of like, okay, here are the ground rules. You say it if you feel comfortable saying it, but recognize that people may not respond, and you may not have intended for whatever you said to come out that way. And I guess what I really was able to glean was the way in which a lot of people were uncomfortable with the word. Not so uncomfortable reading it, because that's a different performance than saying it. So we talked about the performativity of the word. We talked about history. We didn't linger on the history. What we looked at were all those things I mentioned earlier, the ways in which the pop culture kind of talked about the word, whether it was cartoons, postcards, greeting cards, music, all of that. And then we sort of brought it up to the present and looked at sort of rappers and the ways in which many think that, the word was somehow invented 30 years ago.
Now, what's interesting,
with the respelling of it.
Oh, and I was going to go to that because, I was listening to a gentleman who was at an event, and he was talking about kind of comparing the N-word to the word boy.
Right.
He said, so if I say to my son, oh, that's my boy, or if I point to a group of my friends and go, hey, those are my boys. He said, that's how I see the N-word. I don't have a problem when I use the word boy to refer to an African American. But if a white person walked up and say, hey, there's my boy, I'm going to have a problem with it. He said, now I'm just going to say, but he was trying to make this argument that the N-word is okay when we call each other that, because it has been used, even if you respell it, E-R to A, for somehow or another, it's become almost a term of affection. That's my N-word, and I want to kind of unpack that a bit.
Not, and I want to say, and I have said this over and over again, masters thought of their slaves endearingly also. I mean, go watch The Help if you're not going to read a slave narrative. The
same
people
thing.
who owned these slaves thought of them very endearingly. In fact, go look at what Julian Curry says on Def Jam Comedy. It's on YouTube, where he talks specifically about that. As the slaves are building Wall Street, the masters would come up and say, "How's my N-word today?" So you can't use that. And that nonsense about the spelling, go look at a minstrel song.
Yes.
Go read a slave narrative. There is nothing inventive about changing the ending of that. Nothing.
It's the same word.
The root remains the same. Go read Harriet Wilson's Our Nig. So that has, the first piece of fiction written by a black woman. I want to say it's 1845. So go read that. That's what I'm saying. Connect with the history, and then come. And then what I want for those people who insisted this is a term of endearment, and I'm telling you, I had an experience. That person was not yelling at me endearingly. He was upset, and that's the word he pulled out of his arsenal. So that can't be it. And I can tell you there are lawsuits. The University of Alabama State, which is an HBCU, and then there's another one in New York where, and then there's another one in at least a complaint file with HR where two black people, one assumed that he could say, and it was a he, that he could call somebody that endearingly, and they didn't appreciate that. So that's what I'm saying. This is different than Mr. Coates' example about honey. It's a word that is unlike any other. So this sense, and Morrison has said it, and I'm always paraphrasing it, definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. That is not a word that we created for ourselves. It was created for us as a term that initially was neutral for about a minute, and then it became saddled with value, and it became associated with all those things that we still associate with black, linguistically and otherwise. Negativity, disparagement, evil, uneducated, unattractive,
right.
And then pair that with the images that went with those. So until somebody can give me a menu with some things on the buffet around term of endearment, to me it just is this term that people throw out with nothing behind it. There's nothing behind it. And again, this assumption that we've all sort of come to Jesus and agreed that this is how we think about the word is not true.
Yeah, there's not a universal agreement about this word at all. Now, we have another clip from Ta-Nehisi Coates. We're going to take a listen to it, and then we can talk about it.
The question one must ask, if that's accepted and normal for groups of people, we understand that, it's normal, actually, for groups to use words that are derogatory in an ironic fashion. Why is there so much hand-wringing when black people do it? Black people are basically, however you feel about it, they're not outside of the normal rules and laws for humanity. I had a good friend who used to have this cabin in upstate New York, which he referred to as the white trash cabin. He was white. I would never refer to that cabin. I would never tell him I'm coming to your white trash cabin. I just wouldn't do that. You know what I mean? I think you understand why I wouldn't do it. The question one must ask is why so many white people have difficulty extending things that are basic laws, of how human beings interact to black people. And I think I know why. When you're white in this country, you're taught that everything belongs to you. You think you have a right to everything. You have a right to go where you... and you're conditioned this way. It's not, because your hair is a texture or your skin is light. It's the fact that the laws and the culture tell you this. You have a right to go where you want to go, do what you want to do, be however, and people just got to accommodate themselves to you. So here comes this word that, you feel like you invented. And now somebody will tell you how to use a word that you invented. Why can't I use it? Everyone else gets to use it. You know what? That's racism that I don't get to use it. That's racist against me. You know, I have to inconvenience myself and hear this song and I can't sing along? How come I can't sing along? You know what I mean? And I think, for white people, I think the experience of being a hip-hop fan and not being able to use the word is actually very, very insightful. It will give you just a little peek into the world of what it means to be black.
So this idea of trying to unpack this word, right? So that there's so much in this clip by Ta-Nehisi Coates, but I just want to pull out a few little nuggets here.
Okay.
One is this notion that he's talking about the fascination that white people have with wanting to say the word, and their anger or their frustration, maybe not anger, their frustration around not being able to say it. Why can't I say this since I never hear no in anything else that I do? So can you talk a little bit about that, and then also kind of add into that why young black people have a fascination with wanting to say this word, because we're hearing it on both sides.
Right. Well, I do think that there's some credibility to what he says about, this is the one thing you can't say. Why is it that you feel like that's the thing you need to say? And again, I would also associate that with the data that we have that shows that, it's not people of color who are the most consumers of this hip-hop music that is laden with the N-word. So there may be something to that. I remember Paul Mooney saying something about people wanting to say Arnold Schwarzenegger because it's close to that word and they can say it without really having to say it. So, I do think that there's something about that. But again, I have yet to run into white people who don't already know that there's something problematic about that word. Even high schoolers know. And when they are at their most honest, they will say that. In these surveys that I think Myrlie Evers did years ago in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and she was, wondering why were these young kids saying this, and she thought, well, maybe they just don't get it. And so she gave this sort of survey to these students anonymously. They self-identified their race, their age, and gender, and the results she got showed that they really do know that this word is problematic, and they do know what they're doing. And many of them are using the N-word because they think it's cool. But there again, we go into my culture. It's not a costume. If in fact black people can say it, it's as Tim Weiss has said. If there's a double standard, then American history is a double standard. So be it. So I think there's something there. But the other part of your question had to do with black people, and I would even gender that and say that it's a lot of black males who hang on to this word, and it feels a little to me like what one might read in Frederick Douglass's slave narrative from when he talks about slaves who compared who had the better master. The reality is they both had masters. So this nonsense about being a field slave and a house slave, the reality is that you're still a slave. So until we control our language, and even if somebody else is telling us it's a term endearment, and it sounds very robotic to me, I have yet to have somebody unpack that term of endearment in a way that makes sense. And I'm honestly asking that because I don't try to present this as though this is a contract that there's no way to revise. But nobody can actually say anything. And what I go around doing is say, okay, I don't tell you what to say, but here's where I have come, and this is what I have discovered. And the class was part of that. So show me where I'm wrong here. How have you taken this back? And how is this different from how we've seen white people use it? And the fact that if you're using it among yourselves, then white people don't need to use it. And I can tell you if that white person decides that he or she or other person decides that they're going to be mad at you or upset with you about something, I guarantee you that's something they can pull out of their arsenal to attack you with, no matter what your social status is. That's what I said. It started with then Senator Obama. When we became President Obama, it was everywhere. And if you think that it's somehow different with these different spellings, do a Google alert. Type in the word with the ER, the GA, and any other variation you come up with, and see how many positive term of endearment things come out of that.
Yeah, they're
Just
very
do a Google
few.
alert for a week. That's one of the exercises I did with the students. And I said, okay, if we've changed that, then where is that positive stuff associated with the word? And the reality is that it's not. And, even Jay-Z, who, claims he was going to stop using the B word after Blue Ivy was born, and he's got that odd little video about OJ, and you think, okay, so
Yes.
what is he saying? Is he
Right.
saying he's not going to use it, or OJ is still this? But Jay-Z is getting a lot of money by using that as part of the word.
Yeah, it's very odd that
what
that one
troubles
thing.
me about that, but it's not if we talk about, capitalism. I mean,
right.
He's the king of capitalism, he and B, Queen Bee. So here's the thing here is that sexism, racism, homophobia, ageism, all of those things sell. They are marketable. They are things that people want because it helps us organize our world. That's why we still have these Carl's Jr. ads with women dripping stuff out of their hamburger falling down on their scantily clothed bodies. That stuff is popular. And so it perpetuates. That's why we can get these sitcoms that perpetuate stereotypes. That's why Kevin Hart is like one of the top
and working
comedians because he's like a walking minstrel show.
And he fits right into the stereotype. And that's interesting because when you were talking about Jay-Z,
I know the history of that.
Yeah.
When black people started blackening their own faces, like Burt Williams, it was to get a job. I understand that, but I also understand what Du Bois says. And I'm always looking at, Booker T and Du Bois debate and saying, well, Booker T at least has a school down there. So whatever he was able to do, he was convince white people that they need to come out of their pockets, and they did.
To set the school
But
up.
I also have to say that at the end of the day, you got to look at your own moral compass and know what you're willing to step and fetch. And when it comes to that particular word, for me, there is no gray area. And I don't think anybody is confused. They may disagree, but they're not confused. And this is also this is not a generational divide. I know lots of conscious young folks, high school folks, who are doing spoken word stuff about this word. So, and it's not all old people who are saying it. I know some old people who would never say this.
Who would because they have a different, it's not that they have a different understanding. They have a different reality with the word. Correct. It is a word my father would never use because he never heard the N-word as a term of endearment from another black person. Growing up in a Jim Crow South, that is not the term that you used for brotherhood.
And I'm not going to excuse Paula Deen for saying it.
No. Nobody gets excused.
And here's what I say when I say, Paula Deen and Laura Schlesinger and all those folks. It's not just that they said the word. It was all the other messiness that
went around with it, yes.
When Dr. Schlesinger says, she's telling this black caller, well, you shouldn't have married outside your race.
Yes.
Or
everything
I
that comes with
black guy to play basketball on my team. Is that racist? Yes. If you looked around and saw all the people and said, I want you on my team because you're black,
and you fit the stereotype,
that he can play. And then Paula Deen's talking about she wants to dress all of her brother's wedding attendants in slave attire.
Yes.
That is the N-word is just a symptom of that other messiness going on inside. So that's why I said I don't think you can easily take it back. That's why I don't think and some of these people who are arguing to keep it, it is a kind of, it feels to me a kind of desperation because many of those words are also associated with misogyny and homophobia, and I just wonder how you pick and choose which parts of the word you're going to keep.
And I think it's part of just the education with young people. I want to say earlier I had noticed about when we talked about the Jay-Z song that uses the N-word, and I said that it was odd. What I meant by that is that in spending time with young people in unpacking, when you unpack it line by line, that particular song, the amount of just racism, misogyny, like all of that, colorism that's layered in that one song, you just think it's about the N-word and it's kind of funny about money and OJ, but it really talks about the hatred around that we have for ourselves. Now, I'm not saying that's Jay-Z's intent because I have no idea what his intention was. I said, but listen to this song. If you take Jay-Z out of this, that is a very painful song that someone said. I mean, I know he's getting paid from. I said, but think about where we have been as people and this box that we keep getting stuffed back into that's labeled with this word.
But it's hard to take Jay-Z out of it when he's perpetuating the use of the word.
Yes, he is.
In his own stuff. That's what I'm saying.
Well, and that I agree with that. I mean, people
separate the folks from the creators.
Yeah.
But I also know that he's benefiting from that.
Oh, he's absolutely benefiting.
It can be a lesson if we could kind of separate and put it in a box, in that sort of new critical way. But it's hard for me. I mean, I can appreciate that, but it's to me. But I make the same argument about Kendrick Lamar. Kendrick Lamar is, very conscious and he's woke, and there are a lot of black folks who look at him as the Messiah. And I'm saying that argument he makes about this word by spelling Negus has gone nowhere.
No.
Plus, he continues to use it. And Kendrick Lamar has some issues with representations of women.
And which is another piece that needs to be unpacked. So it's this
Absolutely.
idea
and I think
that it's not just the word.
With the kind of male-centric way in which Coates writes and speaks to the world.
I mean, when I actually reviewed his work, it's this idea, where are the women? So apparently you just sprung from the forehead of your daddy,
exactly.
and so did your own son. I mean, that is my Baltimore Sun review of his book, Where Are the Women? Because the way you're writing this is very male-centric.
And so many embracing that.
Yeah.
It's like the misogyny is not there. And misogyny can be manifested in different ways. So I'm thinking, and yes, just because you know one doesn't mean you know the other. But I'm talking about if we're going to hold these people up as these, public intellectuals and scholars, let's look at it intersectionally.
Let's hold all their work up to the lens. Like you have to look at all of it.
And I said, well, and quite frankly, the people who are contending that this Coates piece is so eloquent and it's brilliant, I was like, wait a minute, he's not the first person that said that.
He is not the first person at all.
The first person I remember said it was some black women saying that.
Which is, I think that's the part of it that's so interesting, because when you start talking about who gets the right to have the microphone, who do we lay the history at the feet of, I think we have the same discussion around just the creation of the hashtag Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
That people can name,
where
are the women of color who actually did the labor, did the hard work. You think of the Ms. U, the whole thing around Ms. U. Again, queer black women who don't get the credit, who don't get the fame, who don't get the spotlight, and who get erased. You know the name MLK, you don't know about Ella Baker. I mean, we have to think about that.
Absolutely. Or we know about Cornel West and Skip Gates.
Come on.
And now Mr. Coates. But where are the women who are out there?
Where are the women? Where's the Dorothy I Heights? Where are they?
Exactly.
The Ida B. Wells that black people pull out of their arsenal.
Bell Hooks every now and then. Maybe some Angela Davis, but it certainly pales in comparison to how we kind of hold up these shrines to these other boys saying stuff. Yeah. That's not always stuff that hasn't been said before.
No, it hasn't. It hasn't been.
Who gets the credit for it? That's what I say.
Who gets the spotlight? So it's interesting.
I don't have a personal beef with him, but I guess I respond to the way that people are responding to it, because trust me, practically every white person who knows that I have something to say about this, and black, have sort of said, oh, what do you think about this? This is really brilliant. This is really, I said, well, here are my concerns about it. And
I also think the word brilliance is overused. Right? I think that,
but to me, it's an interesting, and I said this way back when I started as assistant professor at the University of Alabama, and white people were saying, such and such is brilliant, and this is really brilliant. I thought, well, maybe you have to be brilliant in order to recognize brilliance. So to call something brilliant means that you're brilliant.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting self-assessment to me.
It's very interesting. It's also who gets labeled, who gets deemed, who gets knighted. Yes. And I use the word knighted in particular, that when Toni Morrison even said and called, Ta-Nehisi Coates the next, James Baldwin, you have decided that he's going to be the one, even if there are other ones out there.
I read Baldwin now, and Baldwin is way more nuanced.
He is.
And
he's also more critical.
Holistic. And that's not to say that there's not a place for this particular voice, and it is a needed voice, and it is a voice. But I say the same thing about Eric Dyson. In his last one, the last book that he had. His chapter on the N-word essentially says what people have been saying.
Nothing new.
But white people will somehow read this now and think it's kind of a new take on that.
Which is really interesting. I mean, because I tell people when they talk about, I know that we have spun off because this clip is from Ta-Nehisi Coates. This clip is going viral as the answer to the N-word. And I tell people, go back and read Jabari Asim's book on the N-word. Go back and do some history on the word. Right. But when you take a look at Between the World and Me, I tell people, you need to go read James Baldwin's letters to his nephew.